Hello and welcome to episode number 22 of the Transcendent Knowledge podcast. In this episode, we are going to be continuing and concluding our discussion about James Kent's series of 10 podcasts, Final 10 at the DoseNation podcast series, and in general, his thinking and his books and his other podcast appearances. But in this episode, I wanted to, in addition to drawing a kind of final conclusion on the whole thing, I also wanted to pay special attention to episode number 8 of the Final 10 podcast series, because I think that in a lot of ways that is the most relevant to the ego death theory. In episode 8, James Kent is centrally addressing two major issues. One of them is the question of, is there or has there been a tradition of psychedelic use in Western culture? And the other thing he is addressing is the Amanita Muscaria question, or the whole topic of the Amanita Muscaria mushroom and how it has been incorporated into various books and narratives about the involvement of mushrooms and religion. So as I said, James Kent is asking the question, has there been a tradition of psychedelic drug use in Western culture? And he is personally saying no, in a kind of roundabout and fairly unsystematic way, which is actually quite typical of the long-winded podcast.
Right. Yeah, let's note that this particular podcast, number 8, is 3 hours long.
Right. 3 hours long, and a lot of that is very tangential information, which is hardly really relevant to this core, very important question of the history of psychedelic use in Western culture. But Kent is basically saying no, in a roundabout way. There has not been a tradition of psychedelic use in Western culture, although there's something that I've noticed consistently throughout listening to James Kent's podcast, which is that he seems to be often contradicting himself and saying one thing, whereas if you actually put together and spell out the logic of his argumentation, he seems to be saying the opposite of that. And I think that there's a clear instance of that going on here, which I'll try to make clear, where he appears to be arguing on the surface, no, there has not been a tradition of psychedelic drugs in Western culture, but then he also seems to be saying things which very clearly indicate that there has been. The main thing is, in terms of a true religious sacrament versus a false religious sacrament, he clearly says in numerous instances in episode 8 that the psychedelic mushroom or psychedelic drugs in some way are the true religious sacrament, but that as a necessity of an evolving, modernizing culture, that has to be pushed out of existence and replaced with what he also explicitly calls a false sacrament, which is literal bread and wine, plus a text, like the Bible or a religious text.
So he says that it has to be pushed out. It's a necessary part of the evolution of culture. That the mushroom may have been the true sacrament, but it must necessarily be pushed out.
Yes, so you get a model of two distinct types of societies in James Kent's anthropological model. There's the type of culture which has visionary psychedelic religious tradition and sacrament and ceremonies, that kind of thing, which Kent characterizes as Stone Age, tribal, primitive, non-progressive. And then you have this other evolved type of society which has gone through this process of pushing out of existence the truth about the true psychedelic religious sacrament, and has adopted false sacrament and textual scripture in place of that. And that Kent characterizes as advanced, progressive, modern, Western, consumerist, that kind of thing. So it's there's a clear, two-state idea, quite similar to the way that Plato sets it up in the Republic, of the two models of the state, two models of society.
So we're at a stage now where he has to accept that he. Now, I should just jump in here for our listeners that I haven't listened to this. We agreed that I wouldn't listen to this episode, partly because I am far too close to all of the subject matter of the history of Christianity and Greek and Roman antiquity and things like that, that it would have activated my academic side into trying to refute everything in detail. So you're getting me reacting live here. So he has to accept that the mushroom origin theory of religion, he accepts that, but then puts it down and says, well, we shouldn't even bother with taking drugs at all because religion itself is bad.
Yes, this is
that accurate?
Yeah, at the points in his talking when he appears to be supporting that argument. However, there are other points when he sometimes seems to be saying the opposite of that and denying that psychedelic drugs or mushrooms were or are a true religious sacrament. He seems to want to have it both ways. So I'm just, okay. I'm only interested.
Even if those people happen to be correct, we should dismiss, the whole model of psychedelic religion because it's primitive.
Yeah, to the extent that we want to be advanced, modern, evolved people. If we don't want that, then we are professing to want to be Stone Aged, regressive, and primitive. That seems to be his argument.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm not entirely surprised based on stuff he's already said in earlier episodes. This kind of we mentioned this anthropological model of primitive progressing into a modern state. It's funny that James Kent talks about the progress of knowledge a lot and how the scientific method allows for progress, and yet he's here deploying extremely outdated anthropological theory. This is from the 19th century. This sort of model is very common in the 19th century.
Well, I know,
I don't think any professional anthropologists these days adhere to it. That cultures naturally evolve through a series of from magic to religion to science, and that's where we are now. Oh, enlightened us.
Right. It sounds a bit like Mercy Iliad's theories about cultural evolution. But to be honest, I don't think that Kent ever attributes these ideas to anyone other than himself. He seems to be doing kind of first-hand theorizing. So you're saying that it's he probably wouldn't be aware of that link, but that there are previous theorists who have had these kind of models.
Well, I recall either somewhere in these many hours of podcasting or when I was doing some other just research on James Kent online, I thought I recall seeing somewhere that he had studied anthropology at the university level, probably as a university student. I remember seeing that he'd studied I remember seeing that somewhere. I picked up that association, so I think that's somewhere where he's getting this from, but I'm not. Again, I don't know the details there, but it sounds a lot like certain textbook early theories of even this whole framework of the evolution, society evolving in certain ways. It's very tied into. It makes a lot of sense if he is such a proponent of this kind of scientific method in its very atheist-oriented form, skeptical atheist-oriented form, because this evolution of society is somehow analogous to the idea of humans evolving from apes and the evolution of not just that front, but the whole evolution of the species. The idea about human society evolving in a similar sort of way. That's where this idea comes from or is related to the theory of biological evolution. That now we've reached a more advanced state in society, and that's where we are. It comes out of that climate, that intellectual climate in which the theory of evolution was new and needs to be adhered to.
That's interesting, and that also points to an important comparison with the ego death theory. In other words, the question of what is Michael Hoffman's attitude on that issue. And I can't give specific citations to Michael Hoffman, but I've generally formed the impression that as far as Michael Hoffman is generally against this kind of idea that societies and basically everything necessarily evolves over time. And I think he would say that things can go backwards and forwards, and maybe even pointing to the example of like modern era prohibition as being relatively backwards compared to culture in antiquity where drugs were not prohibited. So that's interesting. It's kind of, Kent is stuck in the idea that everything always evolves, that there's just this one universal evolutionary direction that is pulling everything with it.
And that it has in the past, and that it ought to continue to do so right now. And that's how I kind of see Kent's project, is he wants to say, like, no, we've gone off path. We need to focus on evolving in the right way, and we have all these bad ideas now. And so we need to keep evolving, and that's why he wants to get rid of psychedelics, basically. He doesn't want them. He doesn't think they have a place in evolved society.
And actually, that makes me think that there's an area that Kent doesn't address, because I feel that he is, to quite a big extent, stuck in the past. He's stuck in an earlier era. He doesn't really address the very recent wave of psychedelic legalizations that have occurred. Basically only in the United States and also in Canada there has been legalizations of mushrooms have taken place. He doesn't address that. I mean, but I suppose to fit in with his theory, he would have to be saying that that's an example, that means that culture is regressive in those places, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, especially I suppose a big, yeah, I mean, he, for example, he doesn't mention cannabis at all. Not that cannabis and psychedelics are the same thing, but the idea of them, I suppose James Kent would have to say that cannabis is compatible with modern Western culture in some way, that psychedelics are not. And yet cannabis can also provoke freak out, control loss in certain forms, especially in its edible form.
Right, yes, yeah. But so, having spelled out this anthropological theory that he has also mentioned in previous podcasts, he then, following the logic from that, the picture of society that anthropological theory sets up, he then characterizes the position that the modern young psychonaut finds himself in when he's had profound, powerful, life-changing experiences with psychedelics. So then James Kent says that having had that experience, they cannot find a place in the society that will legitimize their experience. And everywhere they turn, they're told that this experience you had, it was just a hallucination. This experience is incompatible with modernity, that kind of thing. And so that's the kind of general ambience in which the pop psych movement, or the modern pop psych community, is formed. It's in this kind of paradoxical, contradictory situation where you have a life-changing experience, but then the culture tells you that your experience was a hallucination and was incompatible with its values. So it's like he's saying that there's this fundamental contradiction is at the heart of modern popular psychedelia. So he says,
do you think that's really sorry to interrupt, but do you think that's really the case anymore? It sounds like that's something that probably happened to James Kent and many other people in the 80s and 90s, that he was told, oh, what happened to you is a hallucination.
That's a really interesting question. That links into what I said about how is basically ever so slightly stuck in the past. It's like James Kent is stuck about 10 years in the past. He's 10 years behind where the modern pop psych thing is. And actually, you're absolutely right. In reality, if you have a shattering or very profound experience nowadays, it's very easy, given the internet and just the general set of resources that are available, to find a great deal of legitimizing and credibility towards that experience, and that's largely because of the success of the pop psych movement in PR. It's actually very surprising to me just how successful pop psych has been in the realm of PR in recent years. And I think, you and I covered in great detail the whole psychedelic neuroscience thing with David Nutt and Robin Carhart Harris. And that seems to me to be a very big part of it. That somewhere,
yes, very successful PR.
Yeah, somewhere lurking in there's some very good PR minds at work. So yeah, absolutely right. The situation has shifted, and this kind of lonely, isolated, alienated young James Kent figure is actually going to be quite a lot rarer in the modern era. So in a sense, that kind of renders the whole of his 10-episode message slightly redundant, in that he's trying to be a voice that can rescue his younger self, or somebody who's finding themselves in the same position that he found himself in, of being denied, delegitimized via the label of hallucination. Interesting. So anyway, so this is probably a mischaracterization of the core concerns of the pop psych movement, but nonetheless, this is how he characterizes it. So the psychedelic community has this inherent credibility problem where they cannot find legitimization and credibility from the external culture, so they have to create it for themselves. And he says that they are lost in magical or wishful positive thinking, and that the connection of religion to psychedelics is all part of this wishful thinking and legitimacy seeking. And this very much ties into James Kent's characterization of psychedelic experience as non-rational. He's saying really that there is no rational reason to connect religion to psychedelic drugs, which to me is absolutely bizarre and sheer blindness and ignorance. Yeah, it displays a sheer blindness and ignorance towards the sheer phenomenology, the fact of the phenomenology, which has been so well established that psychedelic drugs readily and easily cause the full range of mystical experiences.
Yeah, like that like he has become an extreme outlier voice to say that there is no connection at all marks him as an extreme outlier.
Right. And again, here, there's a very clear instance of James Kent professing one thing and yet clearly acknowledging the exact opposite, because he even lists basically every example from the modern accepted literature of people like Albert Hoffman and Christian Ratch of instances where in remote parts of the world there very definitely is a connection between using of visionary plants and religious ritual. And he acknowledges that. He doesn't attempt to argue against that. So his argument ends up being something like, sure, there's this example, that example, that example, these 50 examples of places in the world, which I'm not going to deny. You have people using visionary plants in a religious context. And yet still, it's all just massively over-exaggerated, and really there is no connection between psychedelics and religion. It's just wishful thinking. It's a bizarre inconsistency and self-contradiction in James Kent.
Yeah, it makes me think of a website page at egodeath.com where Michael Hoffman kind of plots out on a matrix different kind of the minimal entheogen theory of religion, the moderate, and the maximal. And these are his ways of kind of drawing out different positions. And it reminds me, I mean, this is a very, I think, important website when I first read it to really grasping the maximal entheogen theory of religion that Michael's developing. But it sounds like James Kent has a minimal view of religion, or a minimal entheogen view of religion, that then has to by the sheer amount of evidence, has to get pulled over into the moderate, but he is still approaching it from a minimalist mindset and he doesn't know what to do with all that data. That's why I think that's where we're seeing this inconsistency. Is he knows there's just so much data for it, and yet he's trying to adhere to the minimalist position.
That's interesting. So he's a minimalist struggling against the evidence for the moderate view. So that's you could say hopelessly lost in terms of the maximal view. He hasn't even begun to see that set of connections that constitute the maximal theory of religion.
Yeah, that it is that psychedelics are the radical claim there is that they have always been the core of authentic religious practice and the ongoing wellspring. It's, I think, a quote from somewhere in Michael's writings, the ongoing wellspring of religion.
Right. So James Kent has characterized the psychedelic community as non-rationally seeking legitimacy via artificially and falsely connecting religion to psychedelic drugs. And in the introduction to episode 8, Kent very clearly says that the focus of this particular episode is to separate that connection. That is very much James Kent's project. He wants to argue, at least in this 50% of when he's talking, that there is no connection between psychedelic drugs and religion. So this, for James Kent, is one of the key pillars of psychedelic legitimization for popular psychedelia, that in their effort to legitimize their personal, individual, mind-transforming experiences, they turn to attempting to claim that psychedelics are the origin and essence of religion. I suppose that would be the maximal view. Actually, that's too hopeful to say that. It's more like they're trying to make some connection between psychedelics and religion, and they're trying to inflate and emphasize that connection as much as possible.
Yes, precisely. I think I agree with what you said about too hopeful. I don't think I haven't really seen anyone make the daring step of actually claiming the maximal view in public, in the pop psych community, so to speak. No, it's more of a vague sense of connection.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So Kent's project of debunking and falsifying the psychedelic theory of religion, as he sees it, has multiple different elements to it, and I'll just try to run through the different ways that he tries to do that. So the first target that he sets in his sights is Allegro, and he comes up with concepts like the cult of Allegro, Allegroism, cult of Amanita. And actually, I want to, as far as possible, give a positive assessment of James Kent's thinking along these lines. And I do think that some of the ways that he thinks are actually quite helpful to think in. They're quite helpful to understand from the point of view of, highly advanced ego death theory level thinking. James Kent characterizes this Allegro cult of Amanita thing as basically a cult that is disguised as a serious academic pursuit. And Kent is also quite explicitly denying that Christianity has any connection to Amanita. So in other words, this is a very dismissive move that he makes, but he entirely dismisses the whole project of trying to find Amanita representations in Christian art as being purely false, purely an exaggeration, without any consideration that even 1% of it could actually be genuine, which is, given the amount of scholarship that has been done in that area, seems remarkably excessively dismissive, even though I wouldn't personally advocate the project of trying to find Amanita representations in Christian art. I think that project has its own problems, but nonetheless, I still think that James Kent is overwhelmingly dismissive of it.
Yeah, it's more like it has its certain, all the Amanita scholarship has its limitations. I think we'll put it that way. It has a certain shape. I think that people know that now. We've had a lot of kind of meta scholarship as well about the scholarship on Amanita. But does he mention? I'm curious. You say he disavows it in Christianity. Does he take on also the claims that have been made about other, say, like mythologies using with Amanita symbology that have been identified by authors? Does he deny, like, say, the Soma tradition having to do with Amanita?
Right. So as far as Soma is concerned, basically the way that Kent deals with Soma is he lumps it in with Allegroism and the cult of Amanita because he uses Gordon Wasson as the figurehead of Soma, and Wasson's theory is that Soma is identified to the Amanita mushroom. So as far as Kent is concerned, Wasson and Allegro are basically grouped together as one, which is all part of this overall thing of Amanita cult, which is actually very similar to the way that Michael Hoffman deals with it. He refers to Wasson, Allegro, McKenna as this kind of threesome of basically all expressing the same idea about the mushroom. There's different aspects of this, because there's part of this is me trying to characterize what James Kent is saying, but then I'm also wanting to point out the really important points that are brought up by this. And I was struggling with this additionally also in the last episode when we were talking about shamanism and that kind of thing, of trying to address it the way that you and I would address it, and also trying to characterize the way that James Kent addresses it. Because basically there's a lot of very useful ideas and attitudes that James Kent raises by embarking in this particular line of inquiry. So I'll try to deal with them both. But it's at one point Kent humorously comes up with the analogy to Where's Waldo, or for British listeners that would be Where's Wally. These books where you have this multitude of characters on a page, like cartoon characters, and one of them is Waldo or Wally, and you're looking for that one. Are you familiar with that?
I am, yes. Had many hours as a child, actually, with them. So.
Right. And I think that comparison is both very funny, but also very apt. And that when you survey the field of Amanita Christianity scholarship, it does start to look like Where's Waldo? Endlessly looking at pictures of Christian art, trying to make connections to Amanita, even very tenuously, where it isn't so super clear. And there's multiple books now on the market that have come out doing exactly that, that whole project. So James Kent is actually correctly identifying here what Michael Hoffman refers to as the monoplant fallacy, which is very clearly fallacious false thinking, that it's a mistake to single out any one plant or drug and then say this is the one drug that is the true religious sacrament. Because from the point of view of the ego death theory, it's really just that any plant or drug that can to any extent cause loosening of cognition is going to be a potential religious sacrament and capable of being used in religious context and achieving mystical experience in ego death.
Yeah, it's like as I recall, Michael points out how brittle and open to attack it makes the kind of proponents of that saying, all what we need to find is Amanita Muscaria. What we need to find is that. It leaves them very open to attack and criticism because it's kind of a weak theory to say that this one plant is the key to everything. This one fungus is the key to this this kind of very large, the claims of the claims are quite large, right? That Christianity was based around psychedelics, or that the claim is not that. The claim is that like Christianity was based around Amanita Muscaria, and that is a far more brittle theory, fragile theory than that Christianity involves psychedelics usage.
Right, it is certainly a much narrower theory, which means that it's a narrower thing that has to be disproved in order to disprove the whole theory of psychedelic Christianity. So it's frustrating because Kent is correctly identifying the monoplant fallacy, but also he's not seeing through it, and he's not seeing the obvious solution to the fallacy, which is just simply to, instead of insisting on Amanita muscaria, this one mushroom, you just have to broaden it out, as you just said, to psychedelic drugs in general. So he identifies the fallacy, but he doesn't correctly identify it as a fallacy, I suppose, is the problem here. And again, you talk about brittle thinking. Kent does exactly the same thing that Andrew Letcher does in his book Shroom, where he attacks this one very narrow version of the psychedelic Christianity theory, which says that there is a priestcraft who are deliberately hiding, in a conspiratorial sense, they're hiding the identity of the true religious sacrament, which is Amanita muscaria. So Michael Hoffman, in his review of Andrew Letcher's book, he did actually call that brittle thinking. Like, it's too narrow a version of the overall theory of psychedelic Christianity.
It is, yeah, that kind of that idea that there's a secretive, hidden connection throughout time is a great mistake of that. Yeah, that kind of Wasson, Allegro. That I haven't read enough McKenna to know, but that I assume as well. Carl Ruck also often engages in this. That's a great mistake of that way of thinking. This automatic assumption that it must have been kept secret and hidden. That kind of like back projects the idea of prohibition onto an era that didn't have prohibitionist laws.
Yes, and I think that Michael Hoffman has very successfully fixed that problematic way of thinking with his characterization that it's not simply hidden, rather the way Hoffman characterizes it is hidden and then it's revealed, and that's the whole shape of mystical revelation in general. It's hidden for the first part of life until the point in life when you have psychedelic initiation, and from then on it's no longer hidden.
Yes, great. Yeah, the open secret kind of model or something like that. That there's a hidden and revealed aspect that mirrors the experiencing itself, the revelation of the hidden level of control. And so that's why you get art that is kind of playfully, in some cases, like integrating mushrooms into its depictions and things like that.
So Kent then has the project of attacking the whole Amanita muscaria mushroom in general. And he has numerous different ways of attacking the broad Amanita theory. One of them is this time-honored technique of character assassination and smearing, which we've seen so much of in previous episodes of the podcast. So in previous episodes, the target has been people like Albert Hoffman, among others. But in this episode, number 8, he turns to people like Jack Herer, James Arthur, and Jan Irvin as people who have expressed the Amanita muscaria theory and who therefore have to be smeared and character assassinated. So he does a lot of that against those characters, and there's a huge amount of basically entirely irrelevant information about their character, such as the fact that James Arthur, he wrote the book Mushrooms and Mankind, which is one of the very early books of Amanita theory. He allegedly got in legal trouble for sexually harassing a child or something like that. Some horrible thing of going to prison and then committing suicide in prison, but actually based on very thin information. And it might be a complete case of mistaken identity against a man whose name wasn't even James Arthur. But nonetheless, James Kent feels it necessary to go into great detail about that, and about the fact that Jack Herer was living in a dirty hippie drug house when he was writing his book, and how he was so lazy, such a lazy stoner, that he never managed to get anything done, and all these, ludicrously superficial personal details about people.
Yeah, does he have like a grudge against these people? Is that, I'm being playful here, but it's sort of like personal grudges here to act out.
I think so much of James Kent's whole project is driven by a kind of bitterness and resentment towards various different people. But actually, to be fair to Kent, I wouldn't say that it's a grudge against the people. I think it's actually a grudge against the ideas, a grudge against the whole collective ideology of pop psychedelia, and that Kent seems to confuse attacking people, smearing them on the personal level, such as referring to Jack Herer and James Arthur as a bunch of dirty hippies. James Kent seems to think that that is a substitute for theory level deconstruction, which is a sad indictment of Kent's whole project. So much of these 10 podcast episodes where he's like bared his soul and concluded, this grandiose conclusion of this major part of his life, so much of it consists of just personal smearing and regurgitating alarmist, media propaganda about drugs. It's absurd. And there's so little self-reflectiveness about that. It's as if his project of, reconciling this lost part of his life is so important to him that he will let nothing stand in his way to try to get his point across in this way and try to smear psychedelia and make out that psychedelia is somehow a bad thing. He seems to overall be a proponent of an egoic level society, a society where there is no psychedelic initiation, where everybody stays on the safe side of psychedelia. But anyway, I'm getting off the topic.
I agree. I mean, it's off-putting and distasteful, the amount of character smearing that goes on.
Yeah, so I mean, that's one of the strategies that Kent uses to attack the Amanita theory. Now, another thing that he does, which is frustrating in virtue of his failure to recognize the monoplant fallacy as a fallacy, is he uses the argument about how unpopular Amanita muscaria is in the modern era as a drug, which is a very valid and important point. Like, I must say, I want to hark back to my own personal journey into all of this. I can remember very clearly in my early 20s when I was a budding psychedelic intellectual, I wanted to go out and read as much as I possibly could about psychedelic drugs, having had these transformative experiences and trying to find legitimization for my own experiences. I can remember the clear frustration of looking at the books and seeing writers like Clark Heinrich writing about Amanita muscaria mushroom when, as far as I could tell, that was just an uninteresting, mildly psychoactive, unergonomic mushroom. The mushroom that I really wanted to hear about was psilocybe cubensis, or psilocybin-containing mushrooms. And it seemed back then as if the only person who was writing about that and satisfying that need in me was Terence McKenna. And I couldn't understand why there were so many writers. Like, I've got the image in my head of Clark Heinrich's book where he's got this great big photograph of Amanita muscaria on the front cover. And it's like, what? So just because the Amanita muscaria is visually striking and the psilocybe mushrooms are completely visually boring, they look not in any way distinctive compared to your general mushrooms. Amanita muscaria is very visually striking, and it's got this very weak, over exaggerated psychoactive effect. Why is it that people put so much more emphasis in the world of literature on Amanita muscaria than they do on psilocybe cubensis? And James Kent is really kind of bringing that point to the forefront, that there is so much reliance on Amanita muscaria, and that, at least the way that James Kent is interpreting that counts against pop psychedelia, and it's a negative point for their understanding.
That's a really great point, though, about, I mean, your description there of your reaction to the predominance of Amanita, I think is a really great point. It fits in with the monoplant problem in a lot of those authors, that they became very focused on that one particular mushroom. And I think, well, you mentioned it's visually striking, and I think that is what, maybe that's the best or the most we can claim about Amanita in Christianity or in other religions, is that it became a focal point because of its very striking visual life cycle, the way it grows quite, its color changes, the way its whole life cycle. I think that the argument could be that is a striking thing for artists to work with. It's not necessary to only say that is the only thing that would have been that anyone would have taken, because of course with this whole argument we're talking about art itself, and we're not talking necessarily about what did people actually take.
Well, except that I think that to some extent in these books, like Clark Heinrich's book, they are kind of making that connection. They're saying that because you see the Amanita everywhere in Christian art, that's actually the sacrament.
No, you're right.
That people would have taken.
Exactly. That's what I would kind of say after all this kind of reflection that we've seen people do on Amanita itself and its connection, is that I think the best we can say is that it's visually striking, and so therefore a good inspiration for artwork.
Right. It's visually striking, and it is a mushroom. It's just not the right mushroom. So this is kind of what I've come to understand from Michael Hoffman's writing about this, is that Michael Hoffman sees Amanita as primarily a symbol rather than primarily an entheogen. It's a symbol of other entheogens, or it's a symbol of collectively all of the entheogens in a theory about psychedelic, of what its significance is for the theory of psychedelic Christianity, is that primarily it's just where you see Amanita, what that means is there's psychedelic drugs there somewhere.
Right, exactly. It doesn't we're not relying upon the actual effects of Amanita here to make the claim about psychedelic Christianity, that mind-altering drugs would be used in Christian practice. We're not relying upon the effects of Amanita or even the presence of Amanita for that. It's that it is symbolically striking, or could be symbolically representative of the full range of ego-death experiencing.
These older writers like Clark Heinrich made the mistake of failing to see that symbolic nature of Amanita and instead interpreting it as a direct reference to a singular plant species, which is a mistake. And it now seems as if James Kent is making basically the same mistake as those writers did when he is criticizing them. So, this is what I came to realize from listening to this episode. I think that the mere existence, the mere presence of the Amanita muscaria mushroom has set psychedelic scholarship back decades in terms of really understanding drugs and symbolism.
Absolutely. It is. Absolutely. That's a yes. I very much agree that there's people have not wasted, but people have spent too much time on it. It leads to kind of a continuing fighting over that. I'm thinking of somebody like Tom Hatsis, who has spent a lot of time criticizing that and kind of made a little reputation for himself by criticizing Jan Irvin. And it seems to have catapulted him to a book deal and things like that. Well, it's not. It's kind of okay. Or Andy Letcher's book as well. It ends up creating its own kind of academic market of arguing over these things that really is not particularly relevant or important or cutting edge, I suppose we'd say in our language.
Yeah, it's a misleading waste of time on the way to the ego death theory, basically. So there's some irony here in the fact that because Amanita has set back psychedelic scholarship in this way, it now seems as if it is also setting back James Kent's own thinking in the same exact way, in his assessment, his critique of the part of pop psych culture that is talking about Amanita. So James Kent has exactly the same blindness about Amanita that the people he is criticizing do. So for example, he uses this observation that Amanita muscaria as a psychedelic drug is incredibly unpopular in the modern world. No, who takes Amanita and goes to a party or goes to a ceremony? It's unheard of because it's not very psychedelic at all. It's not even very psychoactive at all. And Kent uses that argument to try to say that therefore disproves psychedelic Christianity somehow. The fact that the way he says it is, how could this be the true sacrament that has been hidden by the priestcraft for centuries if even nowadays, when everybody has open access to it and everybody knows about it because of these books that have come out, still nobody can be bothered to take it. Hence, that's a score against the theory.
Yeah. It is. But I mean, it's not a score against the psychedelic Christianity theory. It is a problem of the theory, of that very narrow theory. And, yeah. But is this new? Hasn't this argument been made already? What is James Kent doing here that's... I mean, isn't this just what Andy Letcher was saying over a decade ago?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, he doesn't use the same examples as Andy Letcher. Andy Letcher leans very heavily on this door of a cathedral in Belgium, and James Kent doesn't mention that. But it's the shape of the theorizing is exactly the same. It's the same counterattack to a relatively unimportant and very narrow theory. So it's basically uninteresting, but I think it's worth deconstructing just for its sheer relevance, because it's talking about this crucial idea of psychedelia and religion. But, to another point about Soma, you mentioned Soma earlier, which wasn't so much Allegro's concern as Gordon Wasson's. And apart from Amanita Muscaria, other writers have gone to great effort to try to identify Soma, and also in the Western tradition, Kaikion as well. So much ink has been spilled trying to give precise singular identities to Soma and Kaikion, whereas it's all really just a misleading waste of time on the way to the ego death theory, which points out that both Soma and Kaikion are simply going to be entheogenic sacraments. It doesn't matter what they are, as long as they're entheogenic, psychedelic.
Right. That's a great point. I've complained about this in the past recordings too, about this within the Greek culture, the overemphasis on Eleusis and the Kaikion there, and that's a great point. It doesn't really matter proving which plant was used. That is not really where the action is, or what's important or revolutionary in a way. And it I think reflects we don't need that smoking gun evidence in that way. This whole model of how do we prove the presence of psychedelics in the past in past religious cultures, we don't need to find the exact plant in order to do the work of the kind of changing our paradigm about religious history and religion.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, Kent concludes that section by simply saying nobody cares about Amanita Muscaria, and it's that's true and false at the same time. There's true aspects of that and there's false aspects of that. And yeah, it's frustrating that James Kent is caught up in the same mistakes that the people made who he's critiquing. He doesn't move beyond what their real argument is, which is necessary for going further towards the ego death theory. All I have really left is just a few relatively isolated quotes that I think are quite important. One of them, at 1 hour and 9 minutes into episode 8, James Kent makes an important statement regarding identifying mushrooms in religious art as specifically the Holy Grail. So instead of just general Amanita references, it's this specific thing of this cup. And there's been scholarship that has directly said that the Holy Grail, even the shape of it, is the same as the shape of a large, fully expanded Amanita muscaria mushroom. So Kent says, the Holy Grail is supposed to grant immortality, but this mushroom only gets you high for a few hours. The implicit argument being, therefore, it can't be the real Holy Grail. That's James Kent's dismissal of the idea that the mushroom is the Holy Grail is the mushroom. But I think that's very interesting, and it's worth deconstructing that in light of the ego death theory. His statement is, the effect of the Holy Grail is immortality, but the mushroom just gets you high for a few hours. From the point of view of loose cognition analysis, it's like eternity and immortality is related to the idea of eternity and eternalism, a point of view where the mind sees that everything has already happened, the four-dimensional block universe. So James Kent is setting up a false dichotomy here between immortality and being high for a few hours. What he's failing to recognize there, which the ego death theory model clearly explains, is that you can be immortal for a few hours, or you can experience immortality in a mushroom trip. But the better word for it would be eternity or eternalism, but you could equally use the word immortality.
Does he say what he means by immortality? I would assume he means, actual bodily, like literal immortality, that an individual being can live forever.
Right. He doesn't say what he means by immortality, but the direct implication is that whatever he means is just what the holy scriptures that talk about the Holy Grail means. Like the statement is the Holy Grail is supposed to grant immortality. So it's whatever that means. And here you can clearly see James Kent's blindness to the kind of meaning flipping or to meaning that Holy Scripture has, and where if you read a statement like there's this thing, there's the Holy Grail, and when you drink from it, you become immortal, James Kent is clearly failing to recognize the two-level meaning that such a statement has when you come across it in a religious text. And I'm sure that what he means is what you've just spelled out, bodily, physical immortality, living forever.
Yeah. This is a common problem I've noticed, where he doesn't define what he means by these terms, and then just says that, drugs can't be doing that term, in this case immortality. Drugs can't produce that because all they do is just give you a hallucination or something like that, without really defining what he means by immortality. I mean, that phrase of drink from the Holy Grail and get immortality is a really rich phrase. I can think of just right now, just off the top of my head, like several, you drink it and you in fact die ego death. And so there's a meaning flipping game, but it's a way of like getting you to drink the drug. That's like one level. Then there's the level you mentioned about you become eternal because time stops. So you become frozen in time and thus become immortal. You experience that eternalism block. And then another level of meaning flipping, that like once you've had ego death, you become kind of authorized and immortal. You're not subject to ego death anymore in the same way. So you become deathless in that way and become immortal. I mean, it's actually a really rich phrase, but because this is something I keep hammering on in these episodes, but because Kent is such a literalist, he has an interpretive problem. And that's really what I'm interested in here is this what's become clear to me over listening to these episodes is the extent of the interpretive problem of being super literal, basically. That's what I'm trying to get at kind of ineloquently here. But there's an interpretive problem here in James Kent's mindset, and I think in many other people's mindset, that it doesn't have that rich metaphorical, poetic, we might say, grasp at all. It's not even open to that possibility. And you need that to interpret religion. That is a requirement to interpret religion and to interpret philosophy as well and all sorts of other things. It's a requirement. You have to have it. If you're not doing it, you're out. James Kent is out because he's not doing that. It makes me very vehement. You have to do this.
And he's also assuming that his audience have the same exact manner of interpretation, so he doesn't need to spell out what he means by a word like immortality, because all his audience is understanding it the same way that he does. And yet, in your case at least, that's not the case. We require him to tell us exactly what he means. What is he denying when he denies that mushrooms or the Holy Grail grants immortality?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there's a larger comment here I have about it's ironic that James Kent talks about the scientific method leading to progress, etc., of society and intellectual ideas and stuff like that, and yet he is such a regressive intellectual voice. He has not progressed. If we're attached to that model, he has not progressed. He should take up the ego death theory if he wants to make progress. but instead he's stuck in a certain dismissal of religion. He's not attempted to understand it and explain it from within.
So if you see the ego death theory as being fully advanced understanding, then he's pulling in the opposite direction. He's actually not a progressivist. He's not moving in the line of evolution towards the ego death theory. He's actually trying to resist it. He's on the minimal side of the psychedelic theory of religion, pulling against the moderate side, the moderate theory of psychedelic religion, whereas the ego death theory is in completely the opposite direction to that. So he mischaracterizes himself as progressive.
I agree, yes. I think if James Kent were serious, he would engage directly with the ego death theory because it answers precisely what he now, I know I have this tendency to say the ego death theory is the answer to everything, but it precisely fits the shape of stuff that he complains about in pop psychedelia, that it's, pop psychedelia, there's a dark side to psychedelics that no one's talking about. Well, read the ego death theory. It talks about ego death. It talks about mania and madness and how to think of that and characterize it and deal with it. Everyone's like trading in these unscientific ideas and paranormal things. Well, read the ego death theory.
Yeah, the ego death theory makes that forbidden dark side its central point of reference, really. It's a whole theory about the ego death and rebirth experience.
My second point in my rant is, James Kent complains about the prevalence of paranormal beliefs amongst psychedelicists. Well, read the ego death theory. It is not paranormal. And in fact explains a better way of interpreting so-called paranormal claims or supernatural claims via its metaphor interpretation of religion and other paranormal claims. And so it is, from, I suppose, my point of view, completely ridiculous to talk about psychedelic community as being regressive and then to ignore the kind of the best. I'm trying to think of in James Kent's terms about the scientific method and science and engineering. Well, he doesn't think in terms of engineering. That's what we identified last time that Michael really brings, is this engineering perspective. But James Kent should, if he wants to see psychedelics move ahead in his way of thinking, he should read and deal with the ego death theory. It perfectly addresses what he complains about. He just has to get over his block about explaining religion. He just has to put aside his whatever cultural hang-ups he has about religion and get down to trying to understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the answer to all of it. I mean, I think we pretty much said that right at the start of our analysis, is James Kent doesn't get the ego death theory, and that's going to cause a problem for his whole project. And now we're concluding by saying the same thing, that really all James Kent needs to do is to look at the ego death theory, and he won't like its line of inquiry, because the ego death theory does explicitly try to explain religion, and it's like James Kent doesn't want to do that. He would rather destroy religion than to explain it. But on the other hand, yeah, as you pointed out, Michael Hoffman does explicitly deny anything like paranormalism or supernaturalism. It is very much a grounded theory, grounded in rationality, and I think that James Kent would fully appreciate those aspects of it. But yeah, he's too distracted by unimportant arguments and character assassinations and smearing to even be looking for a solution to his problem, which the ego death theory provides.
Yes, absolutely. And I know we're slightly broken records in this, but that's part of our job, I think, is to keep trying to push people in a way to deal with these questions. What we, I think when we look around at the scene of people writing about psychedelics, they are just not dealing with these questions or dealing with them in a really misguided way and getting stuck in certain places. And that's part of our job. I mean, my other kind of message for James Kent and James Kent sympathetic listeners is that if you believe in if you believe in progress in that way, you also have to recognize that the conditions right now, the by which I mean the broadly egoic conditions, the broadly scientific method-oriented conditions, may simply just be one stage of progress.
Right, yeah.
And I think there's a way of looking at the ego-death theory, for example, in this whole realm of the whole idea of trying to integrate psychedelics into our official writing and thinking, our very kind of rationalistic scientific way of writing and thinking about nature and reality and what have you. What James Kent is defending as being like a highly evolved state may only be a phase. Do you see what I'm getting at? That like he is assuming that that is like the end state. That now we have progressed to this point and we don't need to progress any further. We can remain here in our broadly speaking, like rational, ordinary state perspective, and we can dismiss all altered state things as being hallucinations. And I think that is a very overconfident assertion that that is the end state. I think that the ego death theory, we would propose that if we're going to talk about evolutionary states in this way, which I'm already skeptical of, that what we have to integrate the two. I don't want to like fall into the trap of like integration circles or something like that I see popping up among psychedelics people, but that we cannot remain in like an egoic sort of society or one that prizes individual self-control. It will become to the exclusion. We can't keep trying to shut out the self-control loss or religious-oriented self-control loss, however we want to put it, that whole altered state realm and death of possibilism. We can't keep trying to shut that out because it will keep bursting in. I think James Kent would agree with that. It keeps like coming up, and that's what James Kent is for some reason trying to shut the door again.
Yeah, it's funny. At about 2 hours and 30 minutes, towards the end of episode 8, there's a part where Kent starts to get very noticeably angry, and he says, just stop talking about sacred mushrooms already. Just stop it. Stop writing books about them. They're not sacred. Like it's the most emotionally elevated state I think he's in for the whole of the 10 episodes. Like he does really want to shut this out, and he feels like it's a barrage that just keeps coming. These ideas don't go away, and he wants to just deny them and dismiss them.
Yeah, it's immature.
I think that's basically, I was starting to lose interest towards the end of this anyway, and I didn't want to continue and cover episode 9 and 10. I just can't be bothered after this, especially after the how extended this analysis is. So there's nothing else really that I wanted to say about James Kent, but I did kind of want to just make it a bit personal for a second and say why, because it was me who originally suggested to do this, and I was very grateful to you for taking up the project with such enthusiasm. But the reason that I initially wanted to do this is because, in general, I've seen this kind of character trajectory in a number of people, not just James Kent. So, I mean, we've named Jan Irvin, like he's gone very, very similar trajectory of thinking in terms of at one point being all pro pop psychedelia and then flipping against it and being adamantly against it afterwards. And I've always avoided talking about Jan Irvin for various reasons, mainly because he's such a toxic personality and because I don't really take his ideas and his line of thinking I don't take seriously. I think it's not genuine. But in Kent, I see a much more earnest attempt to kind of deal with the whole issue of pop psychedelia and its inadequacies. But also I've seen this in real life among people not on the internet, where at one point they're really super into psychedelics and super enthusiastic about it. And then a couple of years down the line, they are adamantly against it. And they say things like, you know, psychedelics really didn't do that much for me. I thought they were going to be better than they actually are. You know, my life is still boring or normal or things like that. You know, people are disappointed with what psychedelic drugs do. And you can clearly see that in James Kent. And the reason I wanted to deconstruct this and come to a really clear understanding of it is because I've always been very desperate not to end up one of those people myself. I hate to think that in the future, I'm ever going to deny to myself the things that I have been saying and talking about and thinking about and writing about for the last like 10, 15 years. Like the ego death theory and the religious significance of psychedelic drugs. So I guess I'm hoping that by fully analyzing, really carefully breaking down James Kent's line of argument, I can avoid falling into this kind of trap myself in the future. So there's a very personal thing behind this for me. But yeah, so I'm very grateful to you for joining me and doing this along with me.
Happy to. No, that's lovely. I think that something you're touching on is that we have a certain sympathy with some of James Kent's complaints about pop psychedelia, in that there are a lot of overblown claims as to what we'll get out of taking psychedelics. I think, one phrase I've seen been coming up a little bit more in discussions recently, and I think more broadly, is this kind of wellness, that they're going to make us well. And though I think this is tied in with the healing idea, and that they are, we're going to get all this stuff out of taking them. And I think that can lead to, because of the over exaggeration of those claims, it can lead to a lot of people becoming disappointed. And I don't think that's healthy for, I think there's maybe a danger there in the so-called psychedelics community that they have to face. I mean, I'm skeptical of the whole idea. We mentioned this in an earlier episode of there being a community, or of even participating in a community that is just focused on psychedelics, as if they were kind of like absent or disconnected from other areas of life. But no, happy to do so. I would hate to see that in you. So.
Yeah. But obviously it doesn't happen to everybody. And obviously Michael Hoffman is a very good example of someone who has, reached later stages of life and has not abandoned psychedelia, whereas James Kent is clearly. In fact, that was another parallel that I noticed just recently, is James Kent talks about the inevitability of Western culture abandoning visionary psychedelic ritual. And I kind of think that's a reflection of his own life, that he has felt it necessary to eventually abandon what he once thought was really super great and devoted a large part of his life to. He's doing the very thing that he characterizes Western culture as inevitably doing, which is turning its back on psychedelia. But for me personally, I don't want to turn my back on psychedelia. I think psychedelia is awesome and amazing, and it may not have healed every part of my life and made me into some man in a white outfit sitting on a cloud somewhere or whatever. I don't know what this false promise is supposed to be, but I kind of think there's a distinction between James Kent and Michael Hoffman, because James Kent bought into pop psychedelia, mistaking that for the true potential of psychedelic drugs, whereas Michael Hoffman didn't buy into pop psychedelia, and instead he actually figured out for himself what the true potential of psychedelic drugs is. And then I see myself as I've got a bit of both, because there was definitely a time when, to a pretty big extent, although maybe not ever fully, I did buy into that whole pop psych thing, and I got very into Terence McKenna, and that was one part of my life. But then there was a kind of transition period when I started becoming aware of Michael Hoffman's ideas, and they eventually got the better of me. And then I fully and very kind of dramatically abandoned pop psychedelia. And that was the process that I was going through when you and I first started doing this project. I was mentally abandoning and cutting my mental links to pop psychedelia, which was something that Michael Hoffman never had to go through. And James Kent is doing this now, but without the ego death theory.
Right, and with many more years of investment, which naturally does lead to bitterness, I suppose. And I think that, we've talked down in earlier episodes too about the idea of benefit from psychedelics, and in the past too. I think that's a really great larger topic, is what do we expect to get out of taking psychedelics, and how can we characterize what benefits there are. I mean, you mentioned like becoming your joke about becoming like a person floating on a cloud somewhere. And I mean, it's tricky because I would certainly say that taking my encounters with psychedelics have been beneficial in some way, but I think that it's very circumscribed what that benefit is. It's not like it wouldn't be appropriate to say like, oh, all of life's problems are solved or something like that. That's not the point. And but there are, I have gotten a lot of, in fact, I was just communicating at I don't know if you saw some recent comments at my website by Worm Spirit.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Who was a long-time reader of the ego death theory, used to post at the Yahoo group when it was an open group, and we've been discussing benefits a little bit. So I did some work there in a comment trying to work out, what are benefits? What do I think benefits are taking psychedelics and the ego death theory? And I suppose that those two things are always very combined in my mind. I think that's, we've discussed our differing trajectories. Like I was inspired to explore psychedelics in the first place by reading Michael's writings, primarily about, and I suppose filtered through like rock lyrics, and have had actually all of my like encounters with other psychedelics authors have come after kind of taking on board a lot of Michael's writings, and so there's like a certain, I don't know, I guess I'm slightly rambling here, but I mean, I think that there are, when we talk about benefits, I think that could be that's like a useful thing to think over. So what are the specific benefits of taking psychedelics? There's like the benefit of having, we would probably say, of like having that eternalism experience of switching mental world models. That is somehow a benefit because it makes clear the egoic world model and what its limitations are, and how it, almost like how it works, its logic, and what the limitations of that logic is. And that's somehow a benefit, or that somehow brings peace or something like that, a certain kind of peace and light, as people say, to understand. It also brings a lot of terror in the process, of course. But going through that and coming out the other side involves a certain sort of peace. I don't really know what more to say. It doesn't, it's not like it's made my mood, I never get angry anymore or something like that. I think that there's this kind of overblown idea of what it means to be at peace. Like you said, like becoming a transcendent person sitting on a cloud and being totally unperturbed by everything.
Can I just read, there's a very funny quote at 2 hours and 29 minutes into episode 8. James Kent, he's talking about the house that Jack Herer was living in when he wrote his various psychedelics books. And he says, the people living in this house should have been enlightened masters and exemplars of spiritual excellence. They should have been the holiest people on the planet, like the Dalai Lama, and so on. So it's the same thing, this kind of in a white garment sitting on a cloud kind of thing. That's the idealized version of what enlightenment should be.
Yeah, it's like, have we culturally absorbed this certain ideas of the kind of like Eastern gurus, that they are this like, that's what the ideal is something like that, and that any of those people were really, it's kind of this very, it sounds like James Kent was expecting a very kind of what I associate with the New Age in America, kind of like you get out of it and then you become this kind of like person who is totally at peace all the time and never perturbed. And that, I can only agree with that in that kind of mystic sense of like, once you're become rock solid, then you can never be moved, or whatever, when you're frozen into the eternalism block.
But it seems like if the ego death theory is right, then the natural trajectory should be the other way round. And it should be a case that you take psychedelics and you abandon your pre-psychedelic life. Whereas the trajectory that people like James Kent and Jan Irvin are exemplifying is the wrong way around. They are doing the psychedelic thing in early life and then abandoning it and progressing beyond it. And it strikes me that's the other way around from how the ego death theory characterizes mental progression in life.
And initiation, that one is a child, so to speak, and then one is initiated into an adult culture via the combination of psychedelics with some sort of initiation ritual.
So it really looks like James Kent and Jan Irvin have both initiated and then later de-initiated somehow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, there are certain authors who talk about a lack in modern society, modern Western society, a lack of clear initiation rituals is kind of like a topic I see floating around. That there's not really much context for that sort of progression. I don't really put much. I'm not particularly attached to that topic, but I think that is a striking thing at a certain areas of ego death writing about initiation and its cultural place and the relationship between taking the psychedelic and getting into the altered state and a larger cultural issue of initiation. There's something about the flipping of the world model and conversion to that new world model and the initiation cultural examples of initiation. It's like there's the inner core and the outer surface. The inner part being the conversion to the world model and the outer part being some sort of cultural activity or something like that, or new cultural activity. And we don't really have, I guess that's the point, is that modernity as a single state culture doesn't really have that built into, it doesn't have either really built in, I think is part of the point.
I would have thought that the rightful place to look for something like that is in religion. So you've got things like baptism or bar mitzvah, coming of age ceremony.
Great, yes.
But it's just about, you need to know the metaphorical interpretation of those kind of things all point to this cultural activity of taking drugs and then transforming.
I think what I'm assuming is people who, a large number of people who weren't raised with any sort of religious ceremonial background. I mean, I wasn't particularly, who knows about, I don't know anything about James Kent's background or Jan Irvin's background or anything like that, but I think, no, I mean, it's certainly true that those sorts of ceremonies still exist for a number of people. Baptism and bar mitzvahs, kind of now becoming an adult, and I think part of the ego death theory idea is that those develop out of or were in conjunction with at an earlier era, in conjunction with some sort of psychedelic experiencing, or at least were meant to reflect that so that they could then be later understood as being about that.